Hi, my name is Michael Guzwell. This is going to be my in-depth analysis of red tide in Tampa and the problem it creates, as well as the integration of Internet of Things and smart cities. So to begin, I'm just going to run through a quick abstract of everything I want to talk about today. So I'm going to start off by explaining what red tide is and give you a more in-depth uh, understanding of what the problem is, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more of how we affect the increase in red tide blooms and the harmful algal blooms around Tampa and the Florida coast. I'm also going to go talk about the red tide and its effect on marine life and the economy, specifically the Tampa economy, and what that means for us and how much revenue we gain or lose due to this. And then I'm going to go into the Internet of Things and its relation to this problem and how we can tie this all together. Not really going into a solution as much, but more of explaining how this can affect this issue and some steps we could take in the future. So, what is red tide? So red tide, also known as Carina brevis, it's a natural forming large-scale algal bloom where there's a higher than normal concentration of this microscopic alga, which is a plant-like organism. It's found mostly in Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. It's well known because of its red hue. That's why we call it red tide. It's also abbreviated as K. brevis. So it causes red tides because of the algae in the water. You can also see algal blooms with green algae. It's just a different type. But this is one that's predominantly in Tampa and that we've seen frequently through multiple years. There's been many algal blooms that we've seen. So Carina brevis is originated 10 to 40 miles offshore. It forms in oligotrophic shelf waters, which is just large open water, usually low in the ocean with not much life but high oxygen rates, and then moves through currents to go to the coastal waters where there's more nutrient-rich soil and water and minerals, which ultimately leads to a larger growth, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit. So, Carina brevis produces a toxic chemical that can be put in the air as well as ingested in aquatic animals as well as in humans if we swim or interact around it, as well as if we consume marine life that has been contaminated with this, which I will discuss further. So our impact on red tide, it is a natural phenomenon, but it is also accelerated through man-made interactions such as when we put nutrient-rich minerals in the waterway. This can come from agriculture, from deforestation, as well as urban living and waste. But all this goes into the water and then into the bay and ultimately leads to more nutrient-rich growth. It's been observed to thrive in many different nutrient-rich water types. There's no one specific nutrient that causes it to grow. So it's very susceptible to large, massive growth that can be damaging to ecosystems. Since from 1800 to 2000, there's been a threefold increase in nitrogen in the Charlotte Harbor. This is due to increased use in the lands and population growth, and this ultimately leads to larger algal blooms over time. I wanted to give an example of a local instance of this where these nutrients led to a large algal bloom that damaged the ecosystem. So Piney Point in 2021, there was a water leak where 480 million gallons of wastewater was released into the bay, as you can see in here, and I have a better picture on the next slide. You can see through the few days that they had satellite imaging from NASA, you can see the growth due to that nutrient in the water. You can see an aerial photo here. So 205 tons of nitrogen was released into Tampa Bay in 10 days, which for reference, for the lower part of Tampa Bay, which is around here, there's usually around 350 tons of nitrogen released throughout the whole year. So we had almost a whole year of nitrogen released in only 10 days, which can be harmful for the ecosystem. It creates an imbalance, and it can lead to these harmful algal blooms, which was something that could have been mitigated or stopped fully if we had early detection of this, which is something that we can talk about with Internet of Things and smart cities, having that early detection for these things, which I'll go into a little bit more later as well. So the effects of red tide on marine life. All marine life can be affected by HABs, which is the harmful algal blooms, red tide being an example. So fish and smaller aquatic creatures are the most affected. As you can see, if you've been to the coast during one of our red tide blooms, there's large die-offs that you can see on the coast where you have thousands of fish washing up on shore. This is due to brevotoxins in red tide that causes them to swim in circles and be sporadic and ultimately cause death. And it also causes hypoxia, which is where all of the algae takes the oxygen out of the water, and then the fish have nowhere to breathe and ultimately die from this. And then larger animals such as birds, sea turtles, and marine mammals like dolphins and manatees specifically, they're affected by this because they consume the contaminated prey like the fish, and then they ingest these toxins and reduces their functions as well. And then they can get stranded in large algal blooms where they can't leave or breathe through this. So it's ultimately harmful for a lot of animals in the environment. So effects on red tide on the economy. So during the 2015-2016 red tide event, um, there's a large interference in shellfish harvesting in the Tampa area as well as the Charlotte Bay. So during this algal bloom that lasted from November 2015 through April of 2016, the harvesting of shellfish in those regions was decreased. In Charlotte, it was decreased by 40% during that time, and then the Tampa Bay actually closed 80% of that time due to not being able to collect shellfish because of that red tide. And there was an economic loss of 3.25 million total. That comes from a sales loss of 1.3 million, but overall economic impact from that 1.3 million loss in sales due to the closures results in 3.25 million in the whole Florida economy, as well as 90,000 lost in tax generation, um, according to an article released by University of Florida in conjunction with NOAA surveys. There was also a survey conducted through Airbnb that suggested that the concentration of red tide from 100,000 cells per liter of water reduces the daily rate of Airbnb properties by 44 cents, which decreases tourist demand by about 345 reservation days. So the larger and longer that these red tides are happening in Tampa and along the Florida coast, there's decreases in tourism, as well as the fishing market, which decreases overall economy and profits for multiple companies. And like I said earlier, this is a natural thing that happens, but because of our interaction with it and the nutrients we put in the water, this situation is escalating to a point where it's not as natural as it should, and it's doing more harm than good at this point. So the Internet of Things, I want to give a very quick um, summary of it. So I like this quote that I found. It says the network of physical objects that are installed with sensors, software, and other technologies to connect and exchange data with other devices over the internet. So Internet of Things is just using these smart devices to make this intertwined web of smart sensors and devices that ultimately create these smart cities where we can analyze this data and use it to increase efficiency, overall happiness, and just quality of life. So, some ways that we can implement Internet of Things with Red Tide to look at this problem. We have more advancements with buoys that can track, analyze, and disperse more information than ever before. So we have ways to put sensors on these buoys that can look at the samples. They can sample the water and see how potent, like red tide would be in it. We can put these out where red tide forms, and this will give us an early detection system that tells us if this is going to be a problem in the future, so that we can ultimately um, stop this problem before it reaches the coast, where it can grow and harm many more communities in the ocean and on land. And then Tampa Bay runoff and monitoring through IoT sensor devices. This is starting to happen a little bit more throughout the country, where companies are using these sensors in rivers and waterways to make sure that their projects are maintaining government standards and that they aren't polluting waterways with things that shouldn't be there. Kind of like the Piney Point example. If we had these sensors to detect the leakage before it became um, a environment danger, then we could have mitigated the risk and hopefully not have had all that nitrogen get released into Tampa Bay. And that is it. Thank you very much.